Namaskar, friends. Thank you for attending my weekly Dharma talk on my YouTube channel. Repeating yesterday's Dharma talk, which was presented to the Buddha Center in Miem. Today we have two talks planned from my series, my introductory series on the Buddha Dharma, Fundamental View, Chapter 5, beginning with Chapter 5, The Way of Karma. And it should take approximately 1 hour. In a previous talk, we referred to the teaching with its dark and bright counterparts. In this talk, once again, we meet with the concepts of dark and bright, this time in relation to the law of moral causality. The Buddha refers to four possible combinations of cause effects: dark, dark and bright, and neither dark nor bright. Of these, the first three cause more effects. The neither dark nor bright is said to lead to this destruction of karma. The destruction of karma is, of course, the goal of the spiritual path. The Buddha further attributes this realization to direct knowledge, that is, gnosis. Dark causality has dark effects. The Buddha calls these afflictive. He identifies them with hellish states, or states of intense suffering and pain. Bright causality has bright effects. The Buddha calls these non afflictive. He identifies them with spiritual states or states of intense pleasure and bliss. Dark and bright, or bright and dark, causes are mixed. The Buddha says that these combine afflictive and non afflictive aspects. He identifies them with human states as well as lower spiritual and higher animal states, which mix up pleasure and pain. Finally, the Buddha says that neither dark nor bright causes lead to the destruction of karma. He declares that these are associated with volition or the intention to abandon dark, bright, and mixed causes. In other words, renunciation. The Buddha says that good causes produce other kinds of effects. Only by giving up negative and positive causes can one go beyond causality itself, and only by going beyond causality is one emancipated. One must transcend good and evil. The Buddha says that moral causality is not just physical. Moral causality includes verbal and mental actions, but the root factor is not action. Rather, the essential karmic factor is volition or intention, the so-called volitional formations or potentialities. The volitional formations are the second link of the chain of cause and effect, next after ignorance. The Buddha makes this point repeatedly. In fact, the Buddha makes this distinctive contribution to Indian philosophy. Thus, mental actions underlie verbal and physical actions and determine them. The Buddha describes three kinds of righteous and unrighteous physical actions. He describes four kinds of unrighteous verbal actions. He also describes three kinds of unrighteous mental actions. Altogether, these 10 actions produce effects. The three kinds of physical actions are killing, stealing, and sexual wrongdoing. These ethical principles correspond to the first three of the five precepts. Sexual wrongdoing includes adultery or perhaps promiscuity. These forms of abstinence correspond to the positive action of loving kindness. Right actions became the basis of the Mahayana reinterpretation of Buddhist ethics, in which positive actions transcend abstinence. This relationship is like the distinction between right intention and right effort, and between the path of the Arhat and the path of the Bodhisattva. The four kinds of verbal actions are lying under oath, harmful speech, and gossip. These are variations of wrongful speech. The positive actions that correspond to these are truthful, positive, constructive, and beneficial speech. The three kinds of mental actions are covetousness, hatred, and wrong view. Wrong view refers to denying the truth of the teaching. Wrong view includes not believing in the law of moral causality, the existence of other worlds, rebirth, and the reality of spiritual knowledge or gnosis. The positive actions are a positive mental attitude and right view. Right view is the first step of the Eightfold Path. Right view includes belief in moral causality, other worlds, rebirth, and the reality of spiritual knowledge or gnosis. The fifth precept is drunkenness. Drunkenness is not included in this list. Drinking fermented grains that cause heedlessness, quote unquote, seems to be a later addition. The Vinaya does not give it a very prominent place at all. Today, this precept includes all alcoholic beverages. Buddhist religious include drugs, other than drugs taken for a legitimate medical purpose, which is, of course, a matter of opinion. However, one often finds the first four precepts grouped together in the Pali Canon without referring to drinking alcohol at all. In this way, one can see how the precepts expanded over time, and this would also be a way of identifying the early discourses, assuming, of course, that the omission of alcohol is consistent. The Buddha affirms the ability of the person to affect their future destiny and rebirth by cultivating positive intentions. This includes rebirth in the spiritual realms. This way also develops, quote, the liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom that is taintless, with the destruction of the taints, quote unquote. Thus, the Buddha says that one can realize direct knowledge, that is, gnosis, through intention or volition. The cultivation of wisdom and the destruction of the taints are the positive and negative conditions, respectively. The Buddha further describes the exact mechanism by which moral causality works. Unwholesome causality results in rebirth in non human, suffering states. Wholesome causality results in rebirth in a human state. Human rebirth always results from the fruition of wholesome causes. If one is reborn as a human being, due to the fruition of positive causes, negative causes may still come about in the human life. In this case, negative effects or experiences that reflect the quality of the negative cause will undermine the positive rebirth. The Buddha gives 7 examples of good and bad causes and their effects: killing living beings, injuring living beings, anger and irritability, envy, stinginess, obstinacy and arrogance, and lack of spirituality are associated with shortness of life, sickliness, ugliness, weakness, poverty, low birth, and stupidity, respectively. Not killing living beings, helping living beings, a positive constructive attitude, goodwill, generosity, flexibility, and humility and spirituality are associated with long life, health, beauty, influence, wealth, high birth, and wisdom, respectively. The effect corresponds to the good or bad cause. By purging oneself of bad karma by means of abstinence and renunciation on the one hand, and cultivating good intentions through the cultivating of merit through the cultivation of merit on the other, one can generate good karma that will yield the effects to which they correspond in the future. But there is no reason one must wait until the next life. If one destroys bad karma and cultivates good intentions, there is no reason one cannot generate good effects in this life too. However, one should not cultivate these causes out of a purely selfish intention, itself a negative cause. The cultivation of merit is the basis of New Thought, The Secret, and other popular self help philosophies based on cultivating positive thinking. These ways of thinking are consistent with the teaching if they are undertaken with a good intention and due regard to existing karmic conditions. However, one thing these philosophies ignore is the need to purge bad effects by means of renunciation and abstinence. Ignoring negativity can lead to serious errors, including false expectations. It does not follow that one will experience the effects of these actions in this life either. They may or may not be effective based on the available conditions in the present, and other causal factors operating from the past. One might ask, does this not contradict the Buddha's view in caste? It seems to follow from the foregoing that one will only be born in a high caste because of good karma. In fact, it is not contradictory. It may be true that only someone with the right karma will be born in a high caste. Moral causality also causes being born in a low caste. However, anyone can change their karma at any time by exercising volition and intention. On the other hand, the Indian caste system locks one into one's caste for life. Thus, the Buddha does not reject the idea of inferior and superior births or persons. This is absurd. Rather, the Buddha rejects the concept that one cannot change one's karma. In other words, that causality is fate. In fact, the Buddha associated with everyone and accepted all castes and genders into the order for just this reason. All of the qualities that we have talked about are qualities of the person or conditions established at birth. These are tendencies to experience rather than experiences as such. The expansion of this way of thinking to include experiences raises problems like the rape or murder of a child, or mass disasters like a tsunami or the Holocaust. I'm not aware that the Pali texts address these sorts of issues specifically, but there is some evidence that the Buddha did not think that all effects are the result of intention. However, the answer may also lie in the intricacy and complexity of the web of interconnections that constitutes the doctrine of the universal interconnectedness of things, and the literal infinity of the number of past rebirths. Over infinite time, incredibly intricate combinations of circumstances can come together in which all the participants appear to share essentially the same fate. The Buddha summarizes this view of moral causality in the following quote, beings are owners of their actions, heirs of their actions. They originate from their actions, are bound to their actions, have their actions as their refuge. It is action that distinguishes beings as inferior and superior. Quote unquote. The word action here, of course, refers to moral causality. An interesting but often overlooked implication is the specific relationship between past and future lives. Some Western, popular, New Age, or or spiritist beliefs tend to see the karma of one's present life as a fulfillment or positive continuation related to past lives. One is rewarded for good behavior and punished for one's mistakes. Such a moralistic view seems to come out of the theistic tradition, based on notions of teleology and judgment. They imply that there is a development through a series of lives that makes sense and leads towards a goal. Those who think this way often express the goal as acquiring wisdom or insight or the opportunity to express loving kindness. Sometimes they express this in the notion that one chooses each subsequent rebirth to learn some sort of lesson. While it is true that causes or effects create the conditions for the arising of future cause effects, the idea of any meaningful development contradicts Buddhist ontology. First, the world has no beginning. Everyone has lived infinite numbers of lives. Either one has lived and done everything, like Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence, or, if reality differentiates infinitely, human experience is limitless. Either way, there is no divine plan or telos. There can be no goal where one has lived countless lives. There is no teleology here. There is no direction and no goal. Rather, there is a chaotic, seething broth. Sometimes this is ecstatic, more often it is agonizing. In any case, it is purposeless, senseless, and meaningless. Reality has no goal. There is no redemption in, by, or of experience. It is just what it is. Finite beings arise out of this infinite process because while it is producing causality, it is also being effective. Each effect automatically negates its cause by exhausting the energy of the underlying potentiality in an infinitely complex and interactive web of dynamic interrelationships. Once these causal propensities come to fruition, their energy is exhausted and they effectively vanish. This must be the case. Otherwise, there would be infinite numbers of potentialities operating in every moment. In this case, there would be no finite beings. Each moment of experience results from all of these unreified potentialities. Each rebirth is more like a photographic negative of the previous birth than a continuation. For example, a painful human birth may exhaust the negative potentialities, leaving the karmic continuity or mind stream that one calls the self, and I'm putting that word in quotes, of course, free to experience the effects of good causes in a very blissful rebirth, perhaps even a rebirth as a divine being. The reverse may also be true. The question also arises of what happens to the causal continuity once one achieves fundamental awakening. Once one achieves true awakening, one ceases to generate both good and bad effects. This is the neither dark nor bright causality. Thus, only past causes continue to manifest beyond this point. The Buddha says of those who enter the stream that they may experience enlightenment in as short a time as 7 days or in as long a time as 7 rebirths. The root factor is any potential causes that still exist upon awakening. This implies that awakening does not destroy all causes. Even the Buddha continued to experience effects for 45 years after his enlightenment. Perhaps the phenomenon of authentic, highly realized but unenlightened practitioners who suffer themselves or experience other sorts of strong good and bad propensities are in fact intensely working out the effects of their previous potentialities at an accelerated rate. This might explain such crazy wisdom teachers as the homosexual Ramakrishna, the alcoholic Chogyam Trungpa, who literally drank himself to death, the alcoholic and womanizer Gundan Chopal, the sex crazed and abusive Adida, and Aleister Crowley, the self styled great wild beast, who was the disciple of Alan Bennett, Bhikkhu Ananda Mettā, who led the first Buddhist mission to the West in 1908. Crowley was also the spiritual teacher of Gerald York, the personal representative to the West of the 13th Dalai Lama. Of course, I am excluding mere charlatans from this list. Merit. The Buddha says that he experienced 7 eons or world ages in which he was reborn in many spiritual worlds because of practicing meritorious deeds and cultivating a mind of loving kindness in a former life for 7 years. He also experienced hundreds of rebirths on earth as a righteous world monarch. The Buddha identifies acts of generosity, self mastery, also referred to as moral discipline, and abstinence, also referred to as the development of meditation, the fruits of which lead to meritorious rebirths. The Buddha emphasizes generosity and self control, leading to favorable rebirths in human or transhuman states, characterized by long life, beauty, happiness, fame or good fortune, power and influence, and sublime sensory experiences. The Buddha further declares that confidence in the Buddha, the Eightfold Path, the teaching, and the order are even more meritorious. Gifts of food made to the righteous are especially meritorious. Gifts of food are greater even than gifts of great wealth. They confer long life, beauty, happiness, and strength on the giver. One must give them faithfully, respectfully, at the right time, and with a generous heart, without denigrating oneself or others. Once again, the Buddha emphasizes that such gifts need not be self sacrificial or rooted in self hatred. This is like our discussion of the meditation on loving kindness. It is okay to love oneself and give oneself good things, if this love is universal and not self centered. This is only true, however, of those who are morally pure. For those who are morally impure, generosity alone is not sufficient to obtain a superior rebirth. Once again, the Buddha declares that one can achieve a specific kind of rebirth. The quality of the rebirth corresponds to one's intention. This is especially efficacious at the moment of death. Ethics. Other actions that produce superior merit include taking refuge in the Buddha, the teaching, and the order, not killing or harming, not stealing, abstaining from sexual wrongdoing, abstaining from wrongful speech, and abstaining from drunkenness. In other words, spirituality and ethics are also, like gifts, meritorious causal factors. By these means, one will enjoy freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. An even more powerful practice is the observance of the lunar holidays. One may compare observing the new and full moon days to the Judaic practice of Sabbath. Tibetan Buddhists have tsog offering days, also tied to the cycle of the moon. The phases of the moon are the basis of the Buddhist practice calendar. Interestingly, the lunar cycle is also central to Islamic spirituality. The Buddha adapted the Vedic practice of lunar observances for his order. The lunar order determines the new and full moon days, especially in the Theravada. It is obvious that this practice is inherently astrological and implies a belief in the spiritual significance of the lunar cycle. On these days, observers keep the five precepts strictly, including celibacy. In addition, the pious eat only a single meal during the waxing of the sun, an Ayurvedic practice believed to bestow good health. They abstain from entertainment and personal adornments and perfumes, and avoid the use of high and luxurious beds and seats. These extended ethical practices are the eight precepts. The Buddha says that observing the lunar holidays confers even greater merit on the practitioner than the greatest worldly benefits. These benefits include long life and spiritual happiness. Many Buddhists spend these days making offerings to the order. They study the teaching or listen to Dharma teachings and meditate. Thus, ethical and spiritual observances that emphasize the inner spiritual life replace the externalities of a Vedic ritual. It is not hard to see how these practices, practiced by society, would produce a virtual paradise on earth, a so called Pure Land. This contrasts with what one sees in the world today, where gross selfishness and greed govern human behavior. Meditation. The Buddha also discusses meditation, which he declares is even more meritorious than ethical observances. We have already discussed the meditation on loving kindness at some length, so I will not repeat myself here. Concerning this meditation, the Buddha says, quote, "The liberation of mind by loving kindness surpasses the ethical practices and shines forth bright and brilliant." Quote unquote. The Buddha says that the meditation on loving kindness frees the mind from limiting and constricting causes. One imbues the four directions with a mind of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Finally, greater even than all of the foregoing is the merit produced by realizing impermanence, were it but for an instant. This shows how ontological or existential realizations are even more efficacious than ethical realizations. Summary. In summary, causes are good, bad, and mixed. One can also cultivate the cause of abstinence or renunciation. Only in this way is causality transcended. Upon awakening, it seems that it is still necessary to work out unfruited causal potentials inherited from the past. Thus, the Buddha distinguishes between awakening and final enlightenment. Enlightenment results in the complete transcendence of rebirth and represents the end of the path, at least as far as we know. For all we know, enlightened beings may enter a completely new project upon transcending rebirth. Such a project might be entirely beyond human comprehension. It is certainly not the teaching of the Buddha that enlightened beings cease to exist in any sense. Buddhism is not nihilism. Fruited causes disappear, but unfruited causal potentials determine the quality of one's subsequent experiences and the conditions of one's future rebirths. However, causality is not fate. Because of the Buddha potential that is one's true nature, one is an essentially volitional being, free to choose. The primacy of volition is ontological. Reality itself is unconditioned, and therefore absolute. Therefore, although one finds oneself immersed in causality, how one chooses to interact with these conditions is entirely free. That one is essentially free in a causal world is also proof of our essential divinity. Intention is the ultimate cause of causality. It is also possible to infer our causality from our experiences. This meditation can become the basis of self improvement. By abstaining from negative causes and purifying negative effects, cultivating positive intentions, and practicing detachment and loving kindness, one can ultimately transcend moral causality altogether, and so improve one's circumstances and ultimately attain emancipation. To benefit from the accumulation of merit, one must be good intentioned. Bad intentions modify or negate the merit of good actions. One accumulates merit both by performing positive and by avoiding negative actions, offering gifts to the teaching, meditation, and other spiritual exercises, and especially by cultivating spiritual realizations and insights. These exercises are not all equal. Ethics are the least important. Dharma offerings, spiritual practice, and especially spiritual study and realization produce far greater merit than ethical observances alone. Such actions are extraordinarily efficacious. So that completes the first of two uh, chapters or talks that we will present today. There will be a very brief break, and then I will continue with the second talk. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll continue with the sixth talk in the series, The Way of Samsara. The Buddha unmasked attachment, ego conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. He laid bare the gratification and danger of the world. The gratification of the world attracts beings to rebirth in the world. The danger of the world attracts beings to transcendence. Although the Buddha realized these truths prior to his enlightenment, he did not claim to have discovered the way leading to the escape from rebirth until he became enlightened. Following his discovery of the way of transcendence, he proclaimed the solution to the problem posed by the dichotomy of gratification and the danger of worldliness. When the Buddha was staying at Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park, he discussed these issues with the wanderers of other sects. With respect to the gratification and danger of the world, the wanderers and the Buddha agreed. With respect to how to escape from the world, the Buddha disagreed with the wanderers, stating that they did not understand the way of escape from the world in relation to sensual pleasures, form, and feelings. He declared that their doctrines in this regard were deficient and prone to error. In these respects, the Buddha declared his doctrine superior. To illustrate this point, The Buddha compared the wanderers of other sects to blind men trying to describe an elephant. According to this famous simile, some blind men explored various parts of an elephant: the head, an ear, a tusk, the trunk, the body, a foot, the buttocks, the tail, and the tuft at the end of the tail. Limited by their inability to perceive the elephant, the blind men declared the part that they experienced to be the whole elephant. Thus, those who experienced the head declared the elephant to be like a water jar. Those who experienced the ear said that an elephant is like a winnowing basket. Those who experienced the tusk declared the elephant to be like a plowshare. Those who experienced the trunk said that an elephant is like a plow pole. Those who experienced the body said that the elephant is like a storeroom. They all disagreed with each other, and because they disagreed, fell into disputatiousness. In this brilliant simile, like Plato's famous metaphor of the cave, the elephant is the teaching, and the blind men are those who do not know the teaching or know only one aspect or part of the teaching. Similarly, the adherents of sects, whether Buddhist or non Buddhist, see only one aspect. Not knowing the whole, they fall into disputatiousness. One sees this very keenly in the world today. Muslim fights with Jew, Christian fights with Muslim, Hindu fights with Buddhist, Chinese fight with Tibetans, and Buddhists all fight amongst themselves, each one convinced that their religion is best. Yet everyone sees just one part of the whole. In fact, the Buddha says that because this problem is so acute, it is the major cause of unwholesomeness. Quote, I do not see even one other thing on account of which unarisen unwholesome qualities of mind arise, and arisen unwholesome qualities of mind increase and expand, so much as on account of wrong view. Quote unquote. Our time is not vastly different. The truth of the teaching does not lie in any part, but in the whole. One might call this the perennial or primordial philosophy, the realization that underlying all religions and worldviews there is one comprehensive and integral spiritual truth, which can only be discovered by comparing, collating, and reconciling all spiritual beliefs by means of questioning and logical syncretism. This approach leads to its logical conclusion, the single or universal vehicle, in which one mutually harmonizes and reconciles all dissenting beliefs through a process of comparison, analysis, reconciliation, and transcendence, Jung's transcendent function. Samsara literally means faring on. It refers to the process of rebirth, essentially cyclical in nature. Birth gives rise to life, life gives rise to death, which leads to further rebirth based on unripened karma in an endlessly recurrent, continuous cycle. The concept of the world is essentially involved with the idea of time. Life, death, and rebirth are a universal process that does not apply merely to human beings. It applies to all living beings. Indeed, it applies to all phenomena. It is the essence of each moment, the essential nature of which is change. No matter how closely one examines anything, it can be further subdivided into constituent processes and conditions. All phenomena are impermanent and lack indivisible particularity. This recursive deconstruction undermines the very idea of inherent essence. The realization that all beings are non particular and non local reveals a fundamentally relational and processual ontology. This is not a reification, but a dehypostasization, an ontological affirmation of the doctrine of no self. This leads to the realization that all existent things are essentially impermanent and empty, which leads to emancipation. Emptiness is no different from mind or sentience. Ontological emptiness is the essential realization that underlies the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, whose book Process and Reality I heartily recommend. There is no substantive substrate modified by processes. Rather, process itself is the essential nature of reality. It is rather like the vibrating rubber bands of string theory. The foregoing description of reality leads to the realization that the world itself is inherently infinite, both in extent and in duration. Finite objects and experiences precipitate out of this quantum reality, but the world itself has no beginning. How can time have an originating moment? How can there be a time before time? The Buddha says, quote, "This world is without discoverable beginning. A first point is not discerned by beings roaming and wandering on, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving." Quote unquote. In terms of the law of moral causality, based on the identity of cause and effect, every cause is equally an effect, and every effect is equally a cause. There are no uncaused effects, and no ineffective causes. The identity of cause and effect is the basis of the Buddhist rejection of the notion of theism. Theism posits a first cause, itself uncaused or self caused. The Buddha realized the self contradictory nature of a first cause. If God is self caused, the Buddha reasoned, why not simply posit the self caused nature of reality itself? Thus, there is no necessity to posit a creator. Simply posit the beginninglessness of existence as such. In this way, one also realizes the ineffable identity of the world and nirvana, the finite and the infinite. Despite the Buddhist doctrine of the beginninglessness of the world, the Buddha clearly states that one can transcend the world. Through the realization of one's essential nature, the Buddha potential, one discovers its essentially mirage like nature. Thus, one can control karma and thus liberation from it. The transcendence of the world leads to a metaphysical quandary, for if the world is beginningless, how can it have an end? Let us look at this more closely in terms of the individual karmic continuity. Since the world is beginningless, this means that each mind stream is coextensive with it. The Buddha says, quote, "For a long time, monks, you have experienced the death of a father, the death of a brother, the death of a sister, the death of a son, the death of a daughter, the loss of relatives, the loss of wealth, loss through illness. As you have experienced this, weeping and wailing because of being united with the disagreeable and separated from the agreeable, the stream of tears that you have shed is more than the water in the four great oceans. For what reason? Because, monks, this world is without discoverable beginning. It is enough to experience revulsion toward all formations, enough to become dispassionate toward them, enough to be liberated from them." And you'll notice in that quotation there is a progression which is easily overlooked from revulsion to dispassion to liberation. Revulsion and dispassion are not identical. In other words, transcendence arises within the world because of the experience of the world itself. At some point in this process, out of the blind instinctual craving that is the world, beings achieve a level of complexity where the realization dawns, either because of hearing the teaching or even without hearing the teaching, that the world itself is inherently unsatisfactory. Because of the realization that the world is unsatisfactory, one formulates the desire or intention to escape. Eventually, this desire or intention toward transcendence results in the realization of transcendence itself and emancipation. The realization itself is identical with the attainment, but this process may take eons to develop and more eons to be established, consisting of millions or even billions of rebirths, or it may be instantaneous. In either case, it is ultimately attributable to this realization of unsatisfactoriness. Thus, the realization of unsatisfactoriness arises in time and eventually results in the annihilation of time, at least for the individual. Paradoxically, this realization occurs in time and results in the liberation from time. It is a finite process, and yet the world itself is infinite. The great Dzogchen text, the Kunjud Gyalpom, says, quote, "Never having been born, it cannot cease." Quote unquote. Buddhism refers to the three times, past, present, and future. Causality creates this experiential structure. One experiences it as the sequence of cause and effect. However, neither the past nor the future exists, any more than cause and effect exist as separate entities. One imagines that they exist because of memories encoded in the brain. Memories create the perception of past causes. From the notion of past causes, one extrapolates future effects, but memory is just information. It too exists in a single timeless moment, the present. Paradoxically, perhaps, the essential nature of the present is change. One also distinguishes cause and effect. Upon analysis, one realizes that these are not two things, they too are singular. Every cause is also an effect, and every effect a cause. These are all manifestations of the non dual. In this way, one realizes that karma itself is singular, momentary, and ever present. What one calls the karmic continuity or mind stream is just a perception. Therefore, rebirth too is just a perception. It is as illusory as the world itself. This is not to say that rebirth does not occur in an existential sense. The Buddha clearly taught that rebirth is experienced. One may doubt the historical veracity of the specific rebirths described in the Pali Canon, especially the Jataka tales. These stories are largely Indian folklore. However, the concept itself pervades the canon. It is hard to believe either that the Buddha did not teach this or that he himself did not experience past life memories. The whole canon attests to the fact that he did. We are not contesting the phenomenon of rebirth. Rather, we are contesting its nature. Rebirth is right here, right now. It is the essential nature. The world falls away. One is being reborn continuously, right now, right here. The now is all there is. It is the essence of the experience of the present. The ignorance at the root of the volition or intention to be reborn also exists right here and now as its essential nature. The potential for awakening also exists right here, now, and nowhere else. Therefore, awakening itself also exists right here, now, and nowhere else. There are an infinite number of these moments. Reality differentiates itself infinitely. Just in the time it took to read this talk, I am dying and being reborn countless times. I am not you, and you are not me. Neither my realization nor my emancipation are yours, nor yours mine. There is a metaphysical point of view. There is individuality. Being singular, it is inherently indestructible and therefore immortal, or deathless, as the Buddha said. What one experiences as cause and effect is simply the progressive realization of one's individual relationship with all that is. It defines and limits our momentary experience of the present. It is our identity, but it is not an isolated self. It is not a thing. It is a process. The body is no more than an assemblage of such points of view. It is a colony of beings. Karma interconnects all these beings. Extending outward, the body includes all beings ultimately. One speaks of a sequence of such points of view. This is just an illusion. There is only the singular momentary point of view that changes continuously. This dynamic process generates the illusion of time, the world, rebirth, and everything. It is all rooted in volition. The essential nature of reality must be volitional. If it were not essentially volitional, something would condition it. But what can the absolute be subject to other than itself? To be subject to nothing other than oneself is the definition of volition. Thus, to become awakened, all that is necessary ultimately is to choose to be awakened, to realize that one is already awakened. One chooses to be what one is, what one already is, essentially. One needs nothing else. The difficulty of doing this is not because the task is complex, it is because it is simple. In fact, it is the simplest thing in the world. One might object that this view of the infinitely differentiated now contradicts the Buddha's doctrine of no self. But this objection depends on a superficial understanding of what the Buddha was actually rejecting. It is striking upon reading the Pali Canon how frequently the Buddha refers to the self, atta or attan, and yet how consistently he refuses to affirm it as anything permanent, autonomous, or ultimate. The word atta is the Pali form of the Sanskrit atman, which literally means breath. According to the Pali English Dictionary, it was understood in early Indian animistic thought and elaborated in the Upanishads as a small, quote, a small creature in shape like a man dwelling in the heart, quote unquote, which, quote, escapes the body in sleep or trance, quote unquote, and survives bodily death as an immortal essence. This is what the Buddha rejected, not the experience of subjectivity, but the metaphysical reification of that experience into an eternal substance. The modern English rendering of anatta, or as no self, is misleading. It has led to confusion among English speaking Buddhists, often giving the impression that the Buddha denied the reality of lived individuality altogether. An absurd conclusion, since here we are, sentient, reflective, and engaged in the very discourse that denies our fixed existence. What the Buddha denied was not the presence of experience, but its imagined permanence. The Buddha denied the hypostasized continuity of the self, not its phenomenal coherence. The sense of I arises, but it is not a but it is a constructed event, not a metaphysical essence. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, often translated as not self or no self, is perhaps better rendered as selflessness, not in the moralistic sense of altruism, but in the metaphysical sense of the self's insubstantiality. It is not that the self does not appear, but that it does not persist, does not possess essence, and cannot be found upon analysis. What we call I is a contingent designation for a stream of causes and conditions, coherent, yes, but ultimately empty. The English word self comes from the Indo-European word meaning separate, apart. It refers to individuality or the metaphysical point of view. Soul, referring to the spiritual and emotional part of a person, is a much better translation of the Pali word. What the Buddha is denying is the reality of a soul, a living being associated with the heart, separate from the body, permanent, changeless, and intrinsically blissful. The idea of the metaphysical point of view does not correspond at all to the Pali concept that the Buddha rejects. It is more akin to what Mahayanists call the mind stream. This concept resurfaces in Einsteinian relativity in the idea of the four-dimensional continuum. The metaphysical point of view is non-spatial, non-local, non-extended, dynamic, and neither different from nor identical with what one experiences. Although one experiences it as a continuum, its essential nature is non-continuous and momentary. The mind stream is the transdual reality of the self. It is not identical with the concept of a soul. It is more like the essential idea of proliferation of differentiation. The fact that all through the Pali Canon he refers constantly to the deathless shows the absurdity of the notion that the Buddha rejected the idea of a person in any sense. Thus, he clearly posits immortality in some sense. The irreducible is simple, indivisible, permanent, changeless, and blissful. Lao Tzu's uncarved block. This is the teaching, the object of realization. Change itself posits permanence. To say otherwise is to posit the error of nihilism, and the Buddha explicitly rejects this. The Buddha does not refuse to discuss doctrines like eternalism and nihilism, etc., because he has no theory of ontology. Rather, it is because of the inherently confusing and paradoxical nature of the transdual. Whenever the Buddha seems to reject these doctrines or avoids their discussion, they are always set up as systems of logical opposites, the so called tetralemma. This structure indicates the paradoxical nature of the transdual. The transdual must be the essential nature of reality in its ultimate or absolute aspect. The non recognition of the transdual has become the source of endless confusion, especially amongst the adherents of the Theravada sect. Okay, so that does complete our talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. We will return next Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time with another talk in this series of Dharma talks. Before we conclude, I would like to finish with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. According to the Buddha, based on the law of cause and effect, everything one thinks, says, and does has a result. Every result is in turn a cause of further results in an infinitely interconnected network of cause and effect. The Dharma itself is especially efficacious. It creates beneficial results wherever it spreads. This effectiveness is the power of truth. A common term for this effect is merit. Most of the merit of teaching or even talking about Dharma returns, not only to the speaker, but also to the listeners. The dedication of merit establishes the intention to sacrifice the merit that one receives in favor of others. The dedication of merit is an act of generosity. Generosity itself is karmically efficacious and thus generates more merit. By redirecting the merit that one receives to others, the dedication of merit acts like an amplifier, redirecting ever greater merit to others. Thus, one becomes an agent of ever increasing merit. The dedication of merit causes the merit of the Dharma to spread exponentially through the whole system. And please feel free to join me in this. By the merit of this talk, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of saṁsāra, may I free all beings. Thank you, as always, for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. Namaskar.